Joshua Adams. I am on the conference committee and am very pleased to be here moderating this, our third virtual panel. I am assuming that our panelists are here, although there's so many names on the screen right now, but I see Beth and I see Farah, and I also may see Quinn somewhere. Yes, I do. Okay. So, generally speaking, I like to let the virtual panelists introduce themselves first, and we'll get a sense of who everybody is, and then we'll launch into the papers. We only have three, so we've got a bit more time, and I will watch the clock and ping you when we get to about, let's say, 18 minutes or so. So, Beth, why don't you begin our introductions if you can?
Okay, I certainly will. My name is Beth Jensen. I'm a professor at Georgia State University. My field of study is primarily 19th century American literature with an emphasis on Whitman. My paper today, however, is on Gertrude Stein's novella, Melanctha. And I apologize, I thought I'd make it home in time. I'm in the car with an iPhone, so any odd noises, that's my reason.
That's dedication right there. That's to be applauded. Okay, Farah.
Hi, everybody. I am Farah Ali. I am an assistant professor of English literature at Lahore University of Management Sciences. And I'm interested in post-war British theater, and that's my area of research. Today, I'm presenting on Sarah Kane and her play Psychosis. So yeah, thank you.
And last but not least, Quinn.
Hi, I'm Quinn. I'm a graduate student at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. I am a first-year PhD student, so lots of things to still be figured out. But currently, I do modernist literature, particularly literature written by women.
All right, excellent. Well, Beth, if you are ready, I think we're ready to hear you.
Okay, thank you. And let me know if you can't hear me. I can move the iPhone. Melanctha is one of three works in Gertrude Stein's book, Three Lives, published in 1909. It focuses on a mixed-race woman, Melanctha, living in the fictional town of Bridgeport, based on Baltimore. Critic Lisa Ruddick describes Gertrude Stein's Melanctha as a, quote, near feminist work, a work that lacks the overt feminism found in Stein's later writings. According to Ruddick, Stein in her later works, such as Tender Buttons, envisions women as, quote, powerful agents of subversion. However, in Melanctha, according to Ruddick, Stein sees them as, quote, objects of pity. Ruddick also writes that the later works contain a, quote, coded account of what patriarchy is and how it works, whereas the earlier works, such as Melanctha, do not. I would contend, however, that Melanctha does make a damning statement about patriarchy and its destructive effect on women. While Melanctha appears passive and docile at times, she does revolt against an oppressive system. Ruddick associates Melanctha with, quote, impotence and death. However, if Melanctha were impotent, she would be unable to disrupt the system to the extent that she does. She proves to be such disruption that she is ultimately, quote, cast out. Patriarchy's representatives, her father, James Herbert, her lover, Jefferson Campbell, and her friend, Rose Johnson, feel the effect of Melanctha's power and subversion. and they find it disturbing. Ultimately, they all reject her. Melanctha, described, quote, as a graceful, pale, yellow, intelligent, attractive negress, end quote, must repress her desires if she is to survive within her society. In her relationship with her friend Rose, she at first fulfills the traditional feminine role. Stein asks, why did Melanctha Herbert love and do for and demean herself in service to Rose? Even after Rose marries Sam, Melanctha does the sewing and the nicer work in Rose's house and continues to come in every day to help her keep things neat. Rose also goes to Melanctha's home to have her baby, so Melanctha could attend to her while she was sick. As Melanctha tended to Rose, she is described as patient, submissive, soothing, and untiring, as well as subtle, sweet-natured, and docile. To assume this oppressive role, Melanctha must be, quote, strong in her repression. Even though she attempts to suppress her own desires and to strive for what she is told is, quote, right, she struggles. Melanctha Herbert was always seeking rest and quiet, and she always could only find new ways to be in trouble. Rose Johnson, on the other hand, is not governed by, quote, feelings. Quote, Rose had not enough emotion to be really roused by a revival. She also has strong common sense, unlike the, quote, dreamy Melanctha. When the women first meet and begin to, quote, wander, a euphemism for sexual activity, Rose lectures Melanctha frequently about the right way for her to do. Quote, no, I ain't no common black just to go around with any man, nor you, Melanctha, shouldn't neither. Rose accepts society's rules and boundaries and thinks that Melanctha should also. Quote, Rose kept company and was engaged, first to this colored man and then to that, and always she made sure she was engaged, for Rose had a strong sense of proper conduct. Rose chastises Melanctha for her promiscuity, noting that she, Rose, has followed a moral code in her sexual activity. Quote, you know very well, Melanctha, that I's always been engaged to them first. Unlike the rather decent Rose, who is unemotional and rational, Melanctha is dreamy, impulsive, and unbounded. The description of Rose and Melanctha's relationship begins and ends the story with Rose assuming the judgmental role similar to that of Melanctha's father, James Herbert, and her lover, Jefferson Campbell. Just as James and Jefferson attempt to control Melanctha, telling her what is, quote, right, Rose preaches to her about her unacceptable behavior. Quote, you certainly never, no ways, learn to act right, Melanctha. You certainly never do act right, Melanctha. Not to nobody ever. You never act right, Melanctha. Rose's attempts to reform Melanctha ultimately fail. As Rose notes, she, Melanctha, always says yes, yes, all right, Rose, I do what you say, and then she don't never, no ways do it. Rose eventually begins to fear this uncontrollable force, so much so that she warns her husband, Sam, to be careful around Melanctha. Quote, she never does act real right, ever. I hear awful kind of things she's been doing. I certainly am awful afraid Melanctha never will come to any good. You just be careful, Sam. Now you hear me, you be careful. Rose eventually severs her ties with Melanctha. Quote, Melanctha Herbert was beginning now to come less and less to the house to be with Rose Johnson. This was because Rose seemed always less and less now to want her. Rose eventually tells Melanctha not to come anymore. Quote, I guess, Melanctha, it certainly ain't no ways right for you to come here no more. I certainly think, Melanctha, I get along better when I don't have nobody like you are always here. When Rose closes the door on Melanctha, Melanctha feels cast out into the wilderness. Quote, and now Rose had cast her from her, and Melanctha Herbert knew now, way inside her, that she was lost, and nothing anymore could ever help her. Like Rose, Melanctha's father, James Herbert, is described as common and decent enough. despite the fact that he is, quote, brutal and rough to his one daughter, justifying his behavior since Melanctha was, quote, a most disturbing child to manage, a child the Herberts found, quote, very troublesome to have. James Herbert, like Rose, also attempts to control his daughter's sexuality, which much to his dismay began to exert itself, quote, when she was just beginning as a woman. At the same time, she also begins to visit the stables where the, quote, decent, vigorous mulatto John Bishop works, making her father furious. His attempts, however, to control his daughter's sexuality fail, and he is unable to suppress the power she had so often felt stirring within her. By the time Melanctha comes to live with Rose, many years have passed since she had even, quote, heard or seen or known anything her father did. Like Rose, James Herbert separates himself from the disturbing, uncontrollable Melanctha. When the young doctor, Jefferson Campbell, meets Melanctha, quote, he did not at first believe in her. Jefferson, quote, had often before seen Melanctha Herbert, but he had never liked her very well, and he had never believed she was any good, for he had heard something about how she wandered. Melanctha, however, attempts to conform since her desire for Jefferson is initially strong. Melanctha wanted him so badly that she actually stopped wandering. Yet Jefferson and Melanctha ultimately proved too dissimilar. Jefferson describes the life he wants, quote, all colored people to lead. He says, quote, I want to see the colored people like what is good and what I want them to have, and that's to live regular and work hard and understand things, and that's enough to keep any decent man excited. He continues, quote, I don't know, never believe in doing things just to get excited. Unlike Melanctha, who talks of, quote, real, strong, hot love that makes you do anything for somebody that loves you. Jefferson ultimately rejects Melanctha, occurs as they, quote, wander together towards the end of their relationship. As they embrace, all the, quote, old thinking came up very strong inside him, so strong that he, quote, turned away then and threw Melanctha from him. To fight off the desire for Melanctha at that moment, he pleads to God the Father, quote, oh God, Lord, help me and keep me. When Melanctha rejects society's limitations, her father, her friend, and her lover abandon her. With Rose's final departure, she feels, quote, all sore and bruised inside. She was, quote, lost, and all the world went whirling in mad, weary dance around her. At the end, she pays the ultimate price for her, quote, wandering. Alone and marginalized, she falls ill. Quote, Melanctha got very ill. She began to cough and sweat and be so weak that she could not stand to do her work. In the concluding paragraph, a doctor at the hospital tells her that she has consumption and, quote, before long, she would surely die. He sends her from the hospital to a home for poor consumptives, and there the weary Melanctha, exhausted, stayed until she died. Thank you.
Thanks for that. We are now on to Farah's paper.
So just a brief introduction about what I'm going to be talking about today is a play by Sarah Kane, Psychosis, which is basically based on her illness because she suffered from psychotic disorder, which eventually led her to take her own life in 1999, unfortunately. So the play is about the missing communication between the doctor and the patient on a private level, and then she opens up the play later on to address the atrocities on a global level. Pretty much the decade of wars in the 1990s, the foreign policies of Britain, which affected her pretty much, Srebrenica War, the Balkan War, and all of the oppression that was taking place, while she felt that she's unable to contribute to anything or affect any change. So I am exploring the play in light of author Frank theories, in which he described the illness narrative as a quest for something. So that is basically what I'm discussing today. So in his book, The Wounded Storyteller, which was published in 1995, Arthur Frank identifies 3 narrative templates to depict the journey of illness: the restitution narrative, the chaotic narrative, and the quest narrative. Frank poses the question of how we can comprehend illness stories as they are told through bodies affected by disease. This critique focuses on the act of sharing illness stories, particularly considering Sarah Kane's play 448 Psychosis, which was staged in 2000. In the play, an unnamed and ungendered patient figure, hereafter referred to as they, strives to communicate to the doctors that their disease is not merely a pathological mental disorder. They emphasize that their body and mind have transformed into static tools that hinder their attempts to belong and exist in the world. Instead, they argue that their condition is a cognitive disorder which requires treatment through understanding and compassion. This critique offers commentary and insight into Kane's final play, aiming to challenge the notion that it's nothing more than a suicide note. Through an examination of Kane's personal journey with illness and her eventual suicide, this critique seeks to shed light on the mental health issues faced by both patients and healthcare providers, along with challenges they encounter. In his 1995 book, The Wounded Storyteller, Arthur Frank identified 3 core ideas regarding people's suffering. First, they suffer dehumanization by being treated as victims of their own disease, which renders them as passive, objectified, and powerless. Second, ill people will therefore need to express their suffering by holding on to a story to tell about their illness. This does not need to be a complex narrative. Third, he believes that it is not only the patient's responsibility to deliver themselves from their illness by submitting to the doctor's instructions, as previously suggested by Tycho Brahe's theory of the sick role, but also the healthcare provider's responsibility. So how do these stories get to be told? Frank identifies 3 types of narrative through which patients can tell their stories. The first type is restitution narrative, which is the most straightforward type of storytelling. The patient leads a normal lifestyle, which is then disrupted by illness. The patient receives his or her treatment in the hospital, and then they get back to their original activities. The second narrative that Frank highlights is the chaos narrative, which is literally an anti-narrative. In the restitution narrative, one thing leads to another following an order that eventually leads to an ending or a closure. In the chaos narrative, one thing happens after another without any ordering of events, and nothing leads to any ending. In fact, there is hardly any ending. The third type of narrative that Frank mentions is the quest narrative. He likens this to a heroic epic, which starts with a call, followed by descent, suffering, return, and then a material or spiritual reward. The reward in the quest narrative comes when, after recovery, the illness journey exposes the patient to something they feel grateful for afterwards. I think we all remember COVID times when, after people got severe cases of COVID, there was a great resignation, and some people walked out of their jobs, valuing to spend more time with the family or just to spend time without having to go to work. So it's quite relevant. Now back to the play. In Psychosis, the play tells the story of patients suffering from psychotic depression, which is depicted both as a clinical condition and as a state that questions the relationship between self, body, and their rootedness in the world. The patient figure is striving to tell their doctors that their disease is not just a pathological mental disorder in which their body and mind have turned into static tools that undermine their attempt to belong and be in the world, but rather a cognitive disorder that needs to be treated not with drugs, but with more understanding and compassion. They perform their illness in a train of monologues, numbers, quotes from self-help books, and many poetic and metaphorical images. The other day, I was reading an article in the New York Times, and I read sort of a similar story to what Sarah Kane was suffering from, which is communicating the seriousness of her disease to the doctors. So in a recent article called The Memoir of Contested Illness That Takes on the Legacy of Hysteria, Hannah Zevin recounts the story of Emily Wells, a ballet dancer who has been afflicted by undiagnosed illness since childhood that disrupted her ballet career. When her doctors could not find the reason for her illness, they told her that her symptoms belonged to the realms of psychiatry. Her symptoms were not taken seriously, and she was told females who work under pressure tend to feel pain. But it's all in their heads. After her bodily symptoms started worsening, Wells was eventually able to put a name to her illness. The burning sensation, loss of smell, dizziness, and thinning hair were all signs of a rare autoimmune disease called Bejer's disease. Now her consultant rheumatologist told her, quote, "We can know that all this suffering was not only in your head," end of quote. However, since there is no cure for this disease, the clarity of diagnosis brought little relief to Wells, who was offered antidepressants on her way out. Since the play is about psychotic breakdown that blurs the boundaries between reality and different forms of imagination, as Kane once described the play, the narrative of illness takes the form of a series of mini discourses, reflected in the monologues of poetic images, metaphors, medical terms, and prescriptions that Kane sometimes uses to parody medical language. For example, in one part of the play, she says 100 aspirin and 1 bottle of Bulgarian Cabernet Sauvignon 1986 to parody, and make fun of the medical terms that doctors use to talk to her. The patient figure in the play, however, admits their sickness, but keeps asking the doctor for a more compassionate approach to it. The doctor tells them, "You don't need a friend, you need a doctor," to which they respond, "You're so wrong." Moreover, the patient figure in Psychosis is proactive in their attempts at self-healing. They say, "Let's do the drugs. Perhaps I will be a bit more fucking capable of living." Now, there are different dramatic ways in which the patient figure in the play is trying to make the audience experience what they are going through. And one of those methods is using the mirror. So in the first Royal Court production of Psychosis, a big mirror was used to enable the audience to see the drama on two planes so that they could see the actors both in front of them and above their heads. The mirror contributed to shaping the illness narrative on many levels. It commented on the different states of consciousness of the patient figure. At one point, the actors could lie on the floor, and their reflection in the mirror made them look as they were insects trapped on a flypaper, separate eagles at a fairground wall of death. In another interpretation, the mirror served to emphasize the split between mind and body when video images were projected onto the mirror, showing a window opening to the outside street where people are passing by. The split made the audience feel what the patient is experiencing in their incapability of participating in the outside world, making them both audience and witness. Now there's a political layer to the play. It's not only personal suffering, but Sarah Kane is trying to relate to the global suffering. This turbulent spirit is struggling throughout the play to identify the genesis of the illness. We have not been yet told what is the reason for this illness. A struggle expressed in an unidentified sense of guilt. All we know is that they feel guilty. This provides another layer of interpretation that opens up the play to the political violence across the world, which is only expressed in the play in the sense of lack of communication between the doctor and the patient. The patient figure in Psychosis is experiencing a heightened sense of guilt, from people leaving the party because of them to being responsible for mass killing. "I killed the Kurds, I bombed the Arabs," they say at one point. Some Such emotions culminate in repeated command to the audience or to the doctor to look away when the patient is talking to the therapist. However, the command also reflects the split inside the speaking I as the conflation between the patient and the therapist figure increases. We don't know whether it is the speaking I who is appalling and reassuring itself at the same time by saying, "It's all right, I'm here," or it is simply a dialogue between the patient figure and the therapist. The blurring of boundaries is further evidence of the split between body and mind, especially when the patient figure is suffering from severe depression, melancholy, and psychosis, thus experiencing a split between the subject situatedness and embodied in the world experience and the sense of coherence or reality. In other words, the patient figure's body in psychosis is no longer in tune with its surrounding. They say at one point, "I have been dead for a long time." But if the patient is numb and have been dead for a long time, how could they communicate their illness to the doctor or the therapist? Several ways are used in the play. Firstly, the split dialogue that oscillates between the speaking I and a monologue that reflects other experiences evoked from self-help books and medical terms or medicines. Patient decline, seroxide at one point, hypochondria, side spasmodic blinking. Secondly, the patient emphasizes the body-mind split via using metaphors that confirm their physical presence vis-a-vis the disembodied existence that the patient is experiencing. At one point, they say, "Here I am, and there is my body dancing on clouds." Thirdly, the gaps and silences that grow longer by the end of the play, both highlighting the vanishing nature of the patient figure and the loss of its subjectivity by virtue of the sharp split between body and mind that gets wider. In the patient words, "It's myself I have never met, whose face is pasted on the underside of my mind." The split between the patient's mind and body, which feeds into the loss of communication between the patient and doctors, is further explored by Kane via the theme of love and care. The patient figure is attributing their illness to grief resulting from the loss of love and someone to care for. Kane has explored this idea both in, if you're familiar with her plays, in a previous play called Crave and another play called Cleanse. However, while in Crave, the characters Rod and Carl were talking about searching for love, there are no well-defined characters in this play. Saunders, one of the authorities on Sarah Kane, concurs by saying, "At one point, the speaker thinks they have found their catechet other." In one of the doctors, the patient tells the doctor in the play, "Of course, I love you. You saved my life." Nevertheless, it seems that the doctor is not the right object of the patient's love, and the lover is destined to remain perpetually unknowable. At another point, the patient figure in psychosis incorporates the audience into the performance, another way of making the audience going through or experimenting the feelings of the patient by highlighting the sense of vanishing and asking the audience to watch me. This not only invites the audience to understand the patient's dilemma, but also drives us to identify with their experience. This identification is not limited to the patient experience. Anyone who has lost a loved one, lost someone to mental illness, or simply experienced disorientation on any level can imagine what the patient is going through. The patient's insistence on the act of watching rather than feeling invites commentary on yet another aspect of the patient's search for recognition, integration of mind and body, and being seen as a human needing care rather than medication. Kane emphasizes the importance of theater to help people connect with their feelings, no matter how risky this might be. She refers to the theater of Antoine Artaud, in which he envisaged making gestures to audience in the same way those walking to their death would do. The point is to make the audience feel uncomfortable by highlighting the agonies, the suffering that a conscious mind would feel while witnessing it on stage. She emphasizes the act of watching in the end because she wants people to witness rather than just feel the suffering. The mirror technique that she used to surround the audience with what is taking place in the patient's figure's life, the self-mutilation, the patient at some point self-mutilated themselves, that was highlighted in the first two productions of the play at the Royal Court, are methods to communicate the importance of reconnecting with oneself on emotional, spiritual, and physical levels. By the end of the play, however, the stage directions instruct the characters to open the curtain and let the light and sounds of London Street inside. Even though Kane's concerns converge with those of other playwrights of her generation in the exploration of the themes of sexual abuse, the seeds of violence, and the search for love, her play focused on more existential questions such as the loss of religious faith, reasons for general violence, and missing compassion in the world. The themes of care and carelessness take a different shape in this play, in the sense that it is not solipsistic, where it's solely concerned with the patient's figure's journey, but also expands to become an ambitious quest for answers regarding questions of faith, love, violence, general relationships. The caring decade that Saunders mentions in About Kane, one of his books about Kane, was what the patient figure in this play is attempting to locate. It recalls Frank's quest narrative in which the patient not only goes through the illness experience, but also aspires to transform their illness to provoke a broader social change, using their suffering to lessen it for those who would experience the same pain and illness. Kane's patient figure reflects the spirit of the age she herself had witnessed, such as consumer culture and the promotion of the Cool Britannia period, which, according to Saunders, marked the period after the election of Tony Blair as Prime Minister in May 1997. For the Labour Party, promoted as the age of youth and creativity, turned out to be the age of violence, oppression, abuse, and wars. The care disappeared, and people were stuck in a decade that was marked by the siege of Srebrenica as part of the conflict that took place in 1992 upon the collapse of the Soviet Union earlier in 1989, and the images of abuse, humiliation, and cruelty that shaped most of art scene in Britain. The disappearance of care on both local and global levels marks the quest narrative of the patient figure who, despite not finding material reward for their suffering, they have not been healed in the end, is rewarded spiritually, laying their troubled spirit to rest in what Saunders described as similar to the closing of a funeral ritual. Kane used her own illness in the last scene to allow the audience to start their own quest narrative, to re-evaluate their suffering, their lives, their struggles through the play. The play thus is not merely a suicide note, as some critics claimed earlier, but rather both chaos and quest narrative, evaluating the concepts of violence, atrocity, cruelty, and humiliation that are wreaking havoc in the world. Amidst the upheavals the world is witnessing today, Kane's play explains the diseases and its antidote by performing hopelessness, violence, lack of care, and suicidal thoughts in the play. Psychosis gives hope, weirdly, by calling for more compassion, care, and humanity on the audience's part. And this is all for me. Thank you.
And now, Quinn, you are up.
Thank you. Okay. In 1924, Hogarth Press, first established by Virginia Woolf and her husband Leonard, became the first press to publish the complete works of Freud in translation, making it home to the complete psychoanalytic library, in addition to Woolf's writings. Through the Woolf's control of their independent press, Virginia was free to publish her novels as she pleased. Yet her works were not the main source of income for the Hogarth Press. The psychoanalytic library was. Interestingly, Virginia Woolf felt a certain disdain towards psychoanalysis and refused to read many of the works of Freud and the other psychoanalysts of her time. Quote, Woolf's aversion to writing about psychoanalysis is matched by her resistance to reading about it. She claims to have avoided reading Freud until 1939, a deferral that must have required some effort, end quote. Although some of this disdain was certainly based upon the overt sexism of psychoanalysis, Woolf, as an ill woman, also refused to consider psychoanalysis as an adequate treatment for herself and other women. 2, she did not believe the work of psychoanalysts to be smart or new. Because of this, Woolf felt the modernist fear of being x-rayed through psychoanalytic readings, not wanting her work to be considered an x-ray of the artist. Jennifer Spitzer writes about the modernist anxieties around psychoanalysis in her book Secret Sharers. Spitzer uses the words of Thomas Mann to better explain that anxiety. Mann wrote, quote, as an artist, I am not at all satisfied with Freudian ideas. Rather, I feel disquieted and reduced by them. The artist is being x-rayed by Freud's ideas to the point where it violates the secrets of his creative work. Freudian psychoanalysis, as applied to literature, then leaves the author in a vulnerable position. This is true for all authors of fiction, but becomes stronger for authors who admit their fiction is partly autobiographical. While scholars believe that Woolf did not read the works of Freud until 1939, she was certainly aware of the content of his work. Woolf herself claimed to refrain from reading psychoanalytic works, yet her letters from the fall of 1924 indicate that she read proofs of Freud's work. One such letter to Molly McCarthy reads, quote, "I shall be plunged in publishing affairs at once. We are publishing Dr. Freud, and I glance at the proof and read how Mr. A.B. threw a bottle of red ink on the sheets of his marriage bed to excuse his impotence to the housemaid, but threw it in the wrong place, which unhinged his wife's mind. And to this day, she pours claret on the dinner table. We could all go on like this for hours, yet these Germans think it proves something besides their own gull-like imbecility," end quote. This letter also indicated Woolf's negative reaction to such work, thinking it nothing to be noted. Another letter to Roger Fry indicates the successes of such work. Quote, "I am rather alarmed by the productivity of Hogarth Press this autumn, having laid out 800 euros in the works of Freud, which they will sell because he has cancer," end quote. Woolf again showcases her dislike of psychoanalysis in the works of Freud, attributing the work's success to Freud's illness. As many critical analyses of Woolf claim that she had completely avoided Freud's writing until 1939, these letters came as a surprise, allowing readers to believe Woolf may have more knowledge of the works of Freud than she claimed. This knowledge becomes quite interesting as Woolf reflects on her writing of To the Lighthouse. Woolf's letters suggest that she was considering the presence of psychology as she composed this novel. In a letter in May of 1927, Woolf wrote to Vita Sackville West, quote, "I was honest, though, in thinking you wouldn't care for The Lighthouse. Too psychological, too many personal relationships. I think the dinner party the best thing I ever wrote, the one thing that justifies my faults as a writer," end quote. This letter indicates Woolf's concerns about closeness and mindsets in this novel. This is in tandem with her noting that she is proud of her novel, particularly her dinner scene. Woolf writes about her anxieties regarding the perception of the novel, so her showing a fondness of her writing expresses a love for this novel, even its psychological elements. Another one of her letters to Charles Sanger reads, quote, "I confess I want to cut the whole psychology business altogether. It is so endless, but I get drawn in against my will. Those jumps and jolts you complain of are not at all to my liking. Unfortunately, one is doing a very difficult thing with imperfect means. I can never scrape through a book without disaster," end quote. To Sanger, Woolf confessed that psychology is present in all of her writing, although she alludes to the dislike of this psychology. In this, her anxieties about the psychology of To the Lighthouse are present, as she is drawn to it against her will. In both letters, Woolf perceived To the Lighthouse as a psychological text. It would be remiss to ignore the current psychological movement and its impact as she composed this novel. This paper aims to place Woolf's work historically within the psychoanalytic movement and argues that this historical placement illuminates the ways in which anxieties and worries present themselves within the text. The modernist anxiety towards psychoanalysis found a home in Woolf's writing. Woolf, although later writing about composing To the Lighthouse as an act of catharsis, did not want her work to be psychoanalyzed. While Woolf denied reading psychoanalysts before writing the novel, we might argue that a Freudish culture worked her way into the text, meaning the culture and anxiety around psychoanalysis are present in her writings. Woolf played with psychoanalytic tropes such as child-parent relationships, deep examinations of desire, and repressed thinking. This choice of subject matter allowed Woolf to express her disdain for psychoanalysts while also revealing her and other modernist anxieties toward this upcoming field. To be clear, this paper does not aim to psychoanalyze To the Lighthouse or any of Woolf's other works, considering this anxiety in tandem with the post-war mindset that became a part of British culture helps the reader understand the creation of gendered mindsets. This paper considers the mindsets of women in particular, but further editions of this project would like to think about these mindsets more broadly. Gender divides become particularly prominent through the study of grief in her works, especially To The Lighthouse. Considering this novel is historically situated after the First World War and the psychoanalytic movement, grief and memory seem to haunt the novel. Woolf then writes to subvert the ideas of grief in relation to women. Grief and bereavement were very much pathologized, deeming women mad in times of mourning. Woolf is talking back to some of these psychoanalytic ideas. Quote, psychoanalytic studies of hysterics often include bereavement as a contributing factor, but like the nerve specialist, Freud considers it of minor importance, end quote. Here, the grief work primarily falls onto the husband, yet after 10 years, the memory of Mrs. Ramsay lives with the guests of the summer home and haunts the text. Mrs. Ramsay embodies the figure of Victorian mother and woman. It is purposeful that she is never given a first name. This move creates what might be a detachment from the self. Instead of seeing Mrs. Ramsay for who she is, we might see her through her children and the people who surround her. Yet, Woolf again disarms this idea. By allowing her reader to engage with Mrs. Ramsay's thoughts and personal desires, Woolf then reduces the standard of the Victorian mother and the ideas of her contentment. Woolf, with the use of a certain attentiveness, creates a perfect mother whose mental yearnings are somewhat less perfect. One scholar, Daniel Melanctha, views Mrs. Ramsay as subversive in her thoughts. Melanctha writes, quote, at first, as we shall see, Mrs. Ramsay acts as the angel in the house, and Lily simply follows the social norms. Their thoughts, however, indicate much concern about the problematic roles to which they adhere, end quote. While I agree that by bringing us close to Miss Ramsay, the reader sees how she questions her social roles at the time. Mrs. Ramsay is largely content in her role as mother. Mrs. Ramsay is an admitted portrait of Woolf's mother, Julia Stephen. Woolf writes this novel as an act of catharsis, writing quickly and observantly. So, while Mrs. Ramsay's thoughts might at times be questioned, Mrs. Ramsay still paints the portrait of the ideal mother. Mrs. Ramsay is the center of the novel, as those around her consistently consider her as they act and think. Even after her parenthetical death, the novel is still mostly concerned with the world she has created and left behind. For Mrs. Ramsay, marriage and family were the center of her world and the controlling force for her anxieties. Even after she dies, her husband's narrative overtakes the story. The passage reads, quote, Mrs. Ramsay stumbling across the passage. Mr. Ramsay, stumbling across the passage one dark morning, stretched out his arms, but Mrs. Ramsay, having died rather suddenly the night before, his arms, though outstretched, remained empty, end quote. This passage exists within brackets. Mrs. Ramsay dies quietly and seemingly peacefully, refusing even then to make a scene. While Mrs. Ramsay's death happens off-screen, the people around her are left to do the work of grieving her. The act of killing the mother plays with the psychoanalytic trope of killing the father, subverting that role, and leaving the husband to do the grief work. Mrs. Ramsay's mindset is one to be considered as well. Mrs. Ramsay is mostly thought of in relation to her family, her husband, and her home. For instance, after putting her younger children to bed, Mrs. Ramsay thinks, oh, but she never wanted James to grow older, or Cam either. These two she would have liked to keep forever, just as the way they were, demons of wickedness, angels of delight, never to see them grow up into long-legged monsters. She wants her children to stay young because she enjoys parenting them. Often, she is thinking of the state of her home, her bookkeeping, and her husband's emotions. She regulates the home, and when she is gone, her family and friends are left to guess. Mrs. Ramsay haunts this novel. It is the emptiness she leaves behind that is the action. The novel moves on without her. Mrs. Ramsay is the guiding light in this novel. While Woolf uses the character considered grief, legacy, traditions, and mourning, her character is also meant to be a eulogy. In writing Mrs. Ramsay, Woolf allowed herself the peace she assumes psychoanalysts may give to their patients. To the Lighthouse has cemented its place in literary fiction and within the modernist movement. To the Lighthouse is often written about as a work of new women fiction or as a novel about family. While both of these are certainly true, these writings ignore the larger historical context in which Woolf would be responding to. As a feminist author, Woolf opposed psychoanalysis, particularly in its treatment and dismissal of women. She rejected psychoanalysis as a method of treatment for herself and for its place in literature. To the Lighthouse, as it is a novel about grief and women, talks back to Freudian ideas about mourning by asserting the power of grief itself. Instead of thinking about grief as something to be overlooked, Woolf uses gendered mindsets to consider the larger impact of specific and collective grief. Looking at this novel through its place in history illuminates Woolf's strong critical stance in composing the novel. When grounding this novel as post-war and influenced by psychoanalysis, I highlight the important work Woolf has done to reconceptualize mourning. Writing this novel was an act of catharsis, but Woolf did not need to use traditional psychoanalytic methods to undergo her healing. Instead, she grieved through writing. While the grief this novel encounters is personal, it reflects a larger post-war mindset of society that is forced to deal with such emotions collectively. The grief presented into The Lighthouse comes much closer to the current nonlinear understandings of such mournings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Quinn, and to all of our participants, Beth and Farah as well.